As families look for ways to save on groceries, Republicans say they're working to cut costs in Washington. So the big question is this: is President Trump's affordability plan going to help both in reality and in politics? Joining me now is Senior Vice President of CRC Advisors, Matt Whitlock. He's also the host of the 10-Minute Drill podcast, which posts twice a week, and I love it. And also, if you're an early morning person, you can now get it earlier because I made a personal request. Welcome to Perino on Politics. This is where I call up my smart friends and find out what is going on in the state of American politics. Hello, Matt Whitlock.
Good to be with you, as always. My favorite podcast out there.
Oh, why, thanks. Hey, you love Christmas. How's your Christmas season?
It's good. We did our ceremonial massive Chex Mix bake last night. Our entire counter is covered in it, which is awesome because that's what I give out to my team at work.
How's it compare to Angie's Chex Mix?
It's good. Angie helped us improve it. She gave us the sort of spicy tips, and so ours has a little more edge to it, which is really good.
And do you dole this out, or does it just...
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, we have like little baggies that we give out to all of our friends, and it's a good treat. People seem to really like it, and it's all Liz's
The only problem
credit.
with my sisters, and I tell her not to send it to me anymore, is I remember my previous assistant, she ate the entire bag that was sent in one sitting.
And sounds like Caroline.
She was extremely thin girl.
Yes.
But I'll never forget that. I was like, you ate the whole thing?
Yes.
And then, of course, I was
Very
upset because
impressive.
I wanted some more. But you can't
course.
stop eating it.
No, it's impossible. And you can make yourself sick by eating too much.
You can. Well, that's a good public service announcement. Let's talk about this public service announcement. Let's do the segment one on the state of play as to what is going on. We are just off of the special election last week in Tennessee, where the Republican won, but it was probably closer than people would have liked, and it was a little bit of a foretell of things to come. And now you have this week President Trump, who has said the affordability question is a con, but yet he gets it, and now he is going to have a push. In my experience, communications-wise, the media, even though they're always kind of negative against Trump, but unless you make the full pivot and also give them a process story that says, watch this now. Now,
Yep.
President Trump will be talking about the economy. And those are painful articles to be a part of because you're like, obviously, I know the economy is a big deal. But you have to give the press a process story before they will let you start talking about the merits of what you're trying to say. My experience.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And I think the president is recognizing here that there are a lot of things they've done this year that people are not necessarily going to be watching for in, for example, their tax returns. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's been saying this for months. People will get better returns in January, or in the new year. But the media's conditioned people to believe everything about the big, beautiful bill is bad. It's all about cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, things like that. So part of this roadshow will be making sure people remember all the things that we did in that bill, whether it is lower tax rates, higher returns, also things like no tax on tips and expanded child tax credit that are super popular, but never really got a ton of attention.
But do you think that one of the reasons it didn't get attention is because, wasn't that right after the big, beautiful bill, there was all that Epstein coverage and nobody wanted to go do the town halls, and it was like they weren't doing any media.
There was the Epstein coverage. There was Russia and Ukraine. And that's part of the President Trump sort of experience is he's doing a million things at once. And one of the challenges that it creates for himself is it doesn't leave a ton of time to actually take these really important victory laps that you have to take. I was in the Senate in 2017 when we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was a huge, huge middle-class tax cut. But the media had talked for so long about what Democrats were saying about it, which was it's just a tax cut for the rich. And so 4 or 5 years later, when we did the massive studies that showed actually everyone benefited from this, it was too late for anyone to get a political win out of that. So I think this time the Trump team wants to make sure they don't leave that on the table and get out and do it. But I also think you and I talk about this a lot. We talked about it a lot in the Biden years. You can't just talk about it and give speeches and expect people to give you credit. You have to also show some creativity on policy. The biggest thing that Biden did wrong was tell everyone, this is fine. This is great. You're actually doing well. Look at these charts.
Right.
And so I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article over the weekend about how so many members of the Trump team are trying to get him focused on the affordability.
Oh, no, that's the process story I was talking
about. That's the process
yeah.
story. Yeah. And I think that their challenge there is a need to balance making sure people know Democrats' role in driving up costs of everything. They do have a lot of culpability. Dave McCormick was on with Maria Bartiromo yesterday and talked about this really effectively. We need people to understand Democrats did leave us a huge mess. The challenge for us is now by the time the midterms come up, we will have had 2 years and people believe we should be doing things about it. So you have to blend.
I think you pointed this out to me on Inauguration Day.
Yes.
When Hakeem Jeffries said, "What has President Trump done to lower egg prices?" Like, sir, what do you... It's been
literally
8
Trump
hours.
is speaking in one of the inauguration receptions, and Hakeem tweets, "Look at this price of eggs." And everyone just was like, "Oh, how interesting. The Democrats are pivoting to holding Trump accountable," when Trump had been president for like about the length of time you could walk down the hallway, and media didn't really point that out. And so Republicans have always felt like media was eager to jump and shift the responsibility of this. But I do think voters also see that they hired us to do this job, and so we need to show some work towards it. So it's a balance of both. They did this, they created these problems, we are trying to fix it, and here's some new creative ideas that we're not going to let Washington just, derail along the way, because voters don't really take that for an excuse anymore either.
And egg prices are down considerably. Beef prices are up. There's lots of reasons for that. I don't think it's necessarily because there was anti-competitive behavior, but I just think there's a lot of reasons for that. But gas prices are down. But the one thing that people really focus on is that healthcare costs and insurance are up and going up and up and up and up. And the Republicans, to me, always get caught flat-footed, and they can't seem to push competitive measures across the finish line in order to actually start to bring down prices or transparency. You talked about that in 10-Minute Drill last week.
Yeah.
And now I guess that this week there's going to be some sort of a vote about health care.
So there's a big fight.
How are they going to do that in 3 days? I don't get it.
So, well, this is the sort of culmination of the Democrat hostage-taking strategy for the shutdown. Was John Thune agreed, we will vote on whatever version of a Obamacare pandemic premium subsidy bill you want to bring up. And so that's what they're going to vote on this week. Now, Democrats, despite all the fraud we've heard about in the last 2 weeks, not only in Minnesota, the Medicare, Medicaid part of that fraud, but also GAO had a massive study last week showing that we've had billions of dollars going out to fraudulent subsidies. And yet Democrats are still saying we want a clean extension of 3 years. And Republicans are saying, wait a second. This is bad policy. You guys know this is bad policy because you almost failed to extend it when you could do it on a party line vote in 2022. So Republicans are trying to get a group together who would vote on a shorter term extension. I think Susan Collins has a bill with Bernie Moreno that's looking at 2 years, but also has things like income caps. One thing that made it really painful for Democrats in the shutdown was all of this coverage starting to pick up and Bernie Moreno challenging Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor to say, you're trying to just extend this policy that you guys know is bad, that has so much fraud, waste, and abuse, but also is giving taxpayer subsidies to families making $500,000, $600,000 a year. That's crazy. And Chuck Schumer walked off the floor. And yet Democrats are still trying to push this extension. And my biggest sort of reason for that, and actually Hakeem Jeffries on CNBC was talking about this, and Becky Quick and he got into a really testy exchange just a couple weeks ago because Becky Quick was saying, if you actually wanted to extend this, you would look at a compromise because you guys know this is bad policy. You want the political issue. Right. You want these subsidies to expire so healthcare goes up so you can blame Republicans because you know the media will carry water for you like they have.
But also Medicare fees are going to go up for people in January too. So it's not just Obamacare.
It's everything. And that's one thing that Democrats have actually really effectively done with the help of the media is condition people to believe that any increase in their healthcare costs is going to come from Republicans not extending this one pandemic premium subsidy. Now, those pandemic subsidies are actually a super narrow subset of Obamacare users. It is the group that makes over 400% of the poverty limit. Most people are not going to see an impact because of that. They're going to see an impact because Obamacare is terrible and is just like a burning building and also inflationary costs of healthcare, things like that. But people believe that these Obamacare premium tax credits for rich people are going to be because of every problem they have in their lives.
I think I sent you last week. So Kim Strassel has a podcast. She's a Wall Street Journal columnist and editorial board member. And she had a podcast, All Things with Kim Strassel, if you don't already follow. And it was with Avik Roy, who is a policy guy. And it's about why healthcare costs are expensive and what Republicans could put forward that would actually, in reality, help to try to bring down costs. I commend that to everyone. Also, the other thing I wanted to ask you about before we take a break is this Minnesota fraud when it comes to the COVID money and Medicaid. And wow, it runs deep. And this story is not going away because apparently every time you peel back a layer, there's another bit of it. And I wondered if you could focus a little bit on Keith Ellison.
Yes.
So this is something that is not getting enough attention, I don't believe. Explain Keith Ellison, who he is and why he matters in this story.
So Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of Minnesota. And Keith Ellison is interesting in this story for so many reasons. He sort of has like the movie version of corrupt politician stank all over him in this story. But it goes back several years to when he held meetings with members of Minnesota's Somali community to ask them about this program. Those members of the community who were all arrested within a few months of the meeting with him had said our programs to feed the hungry are getting shut down. And we have recorded audio of them going to Ellison and saying they're after us. It's a crusade. It's racist. They're trying to hurt the Minnesota Somali community. And Ellison in that meeting told them, I will help quash these investigations. And Ellison was also asking them for massive campaign contributions for himself and his son. And so he took a lot of money from these people, committed to shut down the investigation of them, and then went about his day. And just on Sunday, he was asked in an interview if there's anything he would do differently. And he said no, because Keith Ellison is deeply, deeply corrupt and very tied to every crazy special interest you see in the state of Minnesota, and needed the Minnesota Somali community to vote for him. And same goes for Tim Walz. But Ellison had much more visibility into the corruption. There's a great line in the New York Times story that sort of blew this up even after, the great City Journal story that really dove into this. New York Times story said there's a cookie jar that keeps on having cookies stolen from it, and somebody's on the other end refilling it every time. That is Tim Walz, right. Keith Ellison, all these people who knew there was bad stuff going on. When fraud reaches $1 billion, just consider like how terrible it had to be and how long it had to have gone on to reach that. And that's what we're seeing right now. And Kim Strassel had another great piece on that. I want to say yesterday.
I know. She's like hitting home runs everywhere she turns.
For
but
all
Jason
of our issues.
Riley, also at the Wall Street Journal, he wrote his column about how sweeping this under the rug and saying, oh, don't blame the Somali community is not going to help them assimilate.
No. And that's a part of this, too, that I think Kim got into her piece that I think is really interesting, is when you have this conversation about assimilation, a professor quoted in the New York Times story about this, who's a Somali American expert whose job is to explain the Somali experience in America. He said part of their culture that they brought here was believing it's normal to steal from government. And so the assimilation part of this, the administration is taking a very tough line on the immigration aspect of this, because they're pointing out our immigration policies have allowed so many people to come into America who not only don't like our country, but only see it as a profit center to take money and send back home. And in this case, back home meant to Al-Shabaab and other terrorist organizations in Somalia. And so I do hope there's a downstream policy impact that looks at every aspect of this and how it got so bad.
I love it that when I have my friends on and we always read the same things, I'll end with this before we take a quick break. Alicia Finley, who also writes in the Wall Street Journal today, has a piece about why autism numbers are so high and why they keep going up. And she points to fraud like this that was funneling money into fake programs, saying that there were more autistic children than there actually were, which took away the money for actual autistic children and put it into numbers so that you end up with a situation that you have the administration saying Tylenol causes autism.
Exactly. And this exists in every state. Bethany Mandel also wrote a really good piece on this a few weeks ago, because she's heard from doctors, or heard from friends who have heard from doctors, who are willing to sell autism diagnoses because it gives you access to more care. And when you look at the massive upheaval Democrats had to cutting any fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid, it's not just because they're worried about good people losing coverage. It's because they rely on these schemes for their political power. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but every time we pull back these layers, we find more. And to your point about this current HHS saying everything causes autism, they're only going to make it worse. And the problem is costs are going to go up and quality of care available goes down.
Darn it!
We could talk about that issue for hours, but I know we've got a million things to cover.
Can we look ahead a little bit? The Supreme Court, they are busy bees over there. What are you watching?
Oh my gosh, the Supreme Court is they always get a little bit of pushback from people who wish they'd take on more sort of tough activist questions. In this term, they're taking a lot of things right on the nose. They have some that are very relevant to current events. For example, today, they've got oral arguments on Trump v. Slaughter, and that's about whether or not President Trump can fire FTC commissioners at will. There is a lot of legislation and rulemaking around who President Trump can fire, but a lot of people, Carrie Severino and others, have written compelling arguments that say if they are under the executive branch, the executive should be able to fire them. And so there's a lot of precedent here that has made it very complicated, but hopefully there's some clarity here from this so that if a president is elected, they can hire and fire the people that they need to run a government. Mm-hmm. We have this kind of shadow fourth branch of government that we've been talking about all year with DOJ trying to trim down the executive branch where they could. This is one piece that will give a lot of clarity to that. One case that was really notable last week was the First Choice Women's Health Center in New Jersey. The pro-life fight over the last several years, the Supreme Court has dealt with a lot of different sort of abortion-related issues. This one is about these crisis pregnancy centers. Now, in New Jersey, there is a pregnancy center called First Choice Pregnancy Resource Center, or Women's Resource Center. They do really amazing work in just providing resources for women who are pregnant or who have just had kids and give them everything from counseling to physical resources. Now, Democrat states do not like these pregnancy resource centers because they do not provide abortion. So the New Jersey Attorney General has tried to shut them down in every way he can, including in this case, subpoenas saying you need to give us all of your donor information, even though you're a nonprofit that's constitutionally protected. The Supreme Court had oral arguments on that last week, and Clarence Thomas got into it with the representative of the New Jersey AG's office saying, have you guys gotten any complaints that people are confused about where their money's going? And they're like, sorry, sir, actually, we haven't gotten any complaints.
I thought that was so weird. And I actually heard that on your podcast on 10 Minute Drill because Clarence Thomas just is basically like, but this is what my question. If New Jersey could never say that center, that they'd ever had a complaint, how did this case get all the way to the Supreme Court? How did they have standing in the first place?
Yep. Well, and that's what's scary about the legal process in so many of these states. The New Jersey courts had to bless this, knowing there was no there. And that's a little bit of the frustration you hear from Clarence Thomas and other justices who are like, basically, how did this even get here? Why are we even having to deal with this? This is so dumb. We've ruled on a million precedents around this. Why are activist courts in states letting things get this far? Which is very similar to a lot of energy cases. The court is also going to be dealing with this term. Yeah. Can, like, the city of Boulder sue energy companies for climate change? And for example, the little mayor of Boulder, Colorado is like a sweet little guy. I don't think he's like super, politically, I don't know that he wants to run for president one day. I think he's just like a nice small town guy. But these left-wing dark money groups have gotten him to sign his name to a lawsuit so they can try and say, hey, Chevron, Exxon, all you guys, you created bad weather in Boulder because you lied about climate change. It's really absurd, but that's one that the court is considering for this term. If they're going to deal with, can these cities and states try and sue energy companies for a global problem like climate change, which is primarily driven by China, India, stuff like that. So there's
the other case that is so interesting is birthright citizenship. So President Trump has said, oh, no, the founders definitely did not mean that people sneaking across the border to have a baby, those are his words, they did not mean that those people could be citizens. It was meant to give citizenship to all of the freed slaves in America. This has been brought up at the Supreme Court before, but this is a different angle on it, and it's a different court. And so that could really be something to watch this spring.
And this is a originalism-focused Supreme Court. So you know that they're going to get into exactly what you're talking about. What was the original purpose of birthright citizenship at the founding? And has it been completely misapplied, manipulated for political purposes over time, things like that? So they'll get into that. But I think between that and the tariffs case, there's a lot of tough questions that the administration is, sort of putting forward. And I will be curious to see where that goes. I think on birthright citizenship, I could see the justices really looking at that originalism issue, but also just, the intent, the good of the policies in the country, things like that. I'll be super curious where that one goes because that one was just announced over the weekend that they're going to deal with this. This term is going to be explosive.
It's a big one. It's a big one.
They're going to make news, way more news than they like to make on this.
And as we finish this second segment, I think everybody can see why Matt is my smart friend. He knows about everything. A question of what am I missing?
So one thing that you and I talk about quite a bit behind the scenes is the dynamics around Europe. And Europe has come in focus because of obviously the situation in Russia and Ukraine, but also with the president's larger trade agenda. And whether you support tariffs or not, one thing that I think a lot of people have agreed with is there are a lot of unfair trade relationships out there that have been allowed to fester. And like one thing I always attribute it to is people like Joe Biden, who have been looking for reasons for Europe to like him so that like he could brag on the campaign trail, every European leader will take my call. The reason that they'll take his call is because he agreed to really terrible policies like things that allow European countries to take, for example, over the weekend, huge blow up for X, Twitter, with the European Union trying to level a massive $130 million fine on Twitter because they wouldn't agree to a number of really kooky sort of censorship adjacent conditions. They even included things like the way that you design the checkmark logo or not willing to share a lot of details about your advertising, repository. This is a shakedown, and they've got a lot of different rules the EU is using, whether it's the Digital Markets Act, trying to basically extract money from U.S. companies, whether it is on the tech side like X, whether it's Apple, whether it's services
Meta,
like
for sure.
Amazon,
They're terrible to
Meta.
Facebook. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And these companies in so many cases have had to just pay out massive amounts of money. And President Trump is looking at this in the larger context of trade negotiations and saying, should we allow this? These guys are asking us to spend so much money in Ukraine in building up defenses for all of Europe. And at the same time, they're gouging us with these really stupid little fees and taxes.
They're also not ponying up their own money. The Washington Post editorial board today writes about how, wait, you want America to put up the money? You have to at least meet us there.
Exactly.
The other thing is, and to bring our podcast full circle, in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, there was a piece about how these Europeans want Americans to have to be, and American companies to have to be, basically have to comply with European law on environmental issues. And they're asking American courts to adjudicate this. And no, I'm sorry. I don't think so.
The one you're talking about in Wall Street Journal was a very, very good piece, particularly about, it might have been the Greenpeace case.
It was
Greenpeace is going to the Netherlands to try and get damages because in the United States, Greenpeace has been held accountable for doing a ton of damage around pipelines where they've held protests. And so going to Europe to try and force other American companies to pay you is insane. It's not going to engender any additional support for the wackos at Greenpeace. But this is a major issue that President Trump needs to make a part of every tariff conversation. You cannot force our company, because the other challenge here is part of the reason that Europe is asking us to bail them out on security is because they're spending all of their money on socialized medicine, on these programs that they can't afford either. And then they
they're
brag
just about to raise taxes in England on everybody. The other thing is, from a healthcare perspective, I feel like the Trump administration should go after Europe on this. So it takes a company forever to get FDA approval.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, my husband's going through this forever. But after several years, lots of money, you finally get FDA approval. But in order to sell in Europe, you have to go through the same process again because Europe won't accept FDA approval. If I were the Trump administration, I would tell Europe, you're going to have to change that.
I mean, I think that would be really valuable, but I think the Trump administration...
Too.
But the Trump administration has their own issues. There was another great Wall Street Journal article over the weekend about Trump's FDA taking so long to approve any drugs. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the RFK regime is very antagonistic towards any kind of drug-making innovation, things like that, because they love the supplement industry.
But it's not just drugs, it's also surgical equipment.
Medical devices, absolutely. All these things. But to your point about Europe, I think that's absolutely right. And when you get into that drug conversation about Europe, Europe is charging small amounts for our very expensive drugs and then expecting us to kind of bail it out by continuing to pay for the R&D here, things like that. So all of these should absolutely be a part of that conversation.
Well, our conversation was wonderful, as I expected. Everyone should definitely follow 10-Minute Drill. 2 days a week, right? Mondays and Thursdays?
Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tuesdays and Thursdays. We record on Mondays, and sometimes you get a Wednesday bonus. Who knows?
I love it. I love you, your family. Please give Liz my best, and we'll see you soon.
I will. Okay. Love to see you guys soon. Thank you.
All right, talk to everybody next week.